feel that it's a justified shift, that the American media is reflecting reality, or has it become too short?
Well, I think, if you go back, we chronicled China's joining the WTO. We chronicled what appeared to be steps that might lead to China becoming a responsible stakeholder. It was the Robert Zoellick who invented the phrase. I don't think we were advocating it, we were trying to chronicle it. And that, that China has changed. I think it's not so much that the press got it. There are lots of things the press got wrong, and it's certainly something we can talk about. But China has changed. I mean, the China that I lived through in the late 80s and then after it began to ease up again, early 90s, following the repression 2-3 years around Tiananmen, it really was changing. I mean, we were not making up this stuff about a more open society. And it was reflected in reporting that became much easier. It was always a headache, but it was much easier to do. You could go around more readily. It wasn't that hard to talk to people. There were obviously lines that if you crossed, you would get into trouble. But China has really changed.
Under Xi Jinping?
I think some of it was beginning before Xi Jinping. And I think the Communist Party was worried that the level of corruption and sort of rot in the system really could present kind of a mortal threat. And they kind of hired Xi to tighten things up. Whether the elders who anointed him anticipated he was going to do what he did, who knows? Because, as I say, we really don't know.
I remember Henry Paulson running around saying that Xi Jinping was going to be a great reformer after he conducted his corruption campaign.
Oh, I went online. I found a whole bunch of headlines in the New York, opinion pieces in the New York Times and the South China Morning Post. Is Xi the great reformer? Well, oops, we got that one wrong. But Chinese got it wrong too. There's an anecdote in the Simon China when Xi put in the change to the constitution to allow himself to essentially rule indefinitely. Jane Perlez of the New York Times told me about, she called this Chinese academic that she was in regular contact with, who was sort of nationalist-ish and largely sympathetic to Xi on many levels, and she said, "What do you make of this?" And she said he was like, "Well, I can't say anything yet. I'm just too shocked." So I think it took people in the Chinese system by surprise. It's not like we missed something, we collectively, the press, missed something that was glaringly obvious that was evident in China. And it's a function of the fact that we just don't know very much about Xi. And we don't know very much about the really elite level politics. And so there's endless speculation. Maybe in a dozen years you'll find out more. I mean, one of the things that was very interesting to me in researching the book is I went back and I watched a lot of the coverage. And it's fun to go back and see what people were writing in the 50s and 60s. But what's striking to me is, on balance, I would say the American press got it right on the broad brush strokes more often than they got it wrong. They got plenty wrong and lots of details wrong. But the broad outlines of the dynamics of the power struggle, all that, they basically got more right than wrong.
So you don't think the American media, the Western media, fundamentally misread who Xi Jinping was? It just wasn't clear who he was.
There's always, we just didn't know. So you project on it what you think, okay, he worked in one of the provincial areas and his father was a quasi-reformist guy during the early days of reform. So you grab it, you look for the crumbs or grasp at straws or whatever, and you try and construct the narrative because you've got to follow your story. But we didn't really know, and he obviously played his cards. I think a lot of the high-level people he purged didn't really know either.
So the Chinese talk about the global discourse. They're masters of information and propaganda, and they allege that the Western media is engaged in a campaign against the Communist Party by concentrating on things we think are wrong. we think it's wrong that the Uyghurs are being essentially assimilated. We think it's wrong what they did in Hong Kong, wiping out democracy, violating their agreement. We think it's wrong that the Chinese are supporting Moscow in the war in Ukraine. Are we, the Western media, projecting values we shouldn't be projecting, or are we doing our job?
Well, I think that, you know, if they read this book, they would have a much better sense of how journalism actually works. There's an old joke that the two things you don't want to see the inside of are a sausage factory and a newsroom, and for the same reason. But, you know, American Western journalism at its finest has certain values that come with the craft of journalism. It's to hold the powerful accountable, to be a voice for the voiceless, to shed a light in dark places that powerful interests may not necessarily want exposed, and that's part of a democracy, giving people the information so that they can make up their own minds and behave accordingly. That's what, in a democracy, ideally, the West, you know, the media does. There are plenty of examples in the States and in Britain and elsewhere of how that's not always true in practice, and there are lots of issues about the media. But that is sort of where we come from. And so you go to China, you're going to do the same thing. And partly it's also the definition of what's news. You know, I mean, I flew from Taiwan to San Francisco last week, and my plane landed. It wasn't in the news, but if the plane had landed in the Bay and we'd all died, it would have been news. It's just the way it works. And that's sort of what journalists do. I think anybody who's done this work will realize the notion of a campaign is nonsense. You get up in the morning as the CNN correspondent or the RTE correspondent, BBC correspondent, and it's like, oh, they want a story tonight. Oh God, we got 7 hours to do it. We're going to get the video. Is there somebody we can get a soundbite for? Is the internet working to do a feed? And you know, people today are lucky that it's the internet. When I did it, you had to drive to the TV station in the middle of the night and convince your editors to pay $2,000 for a satellite feed. And so all of these things. And before that, people in the book talk about going to the Dianbaodalo, the telegraph office in Beijing, and typing stuff out on a telex machine. It's fun when I do talks, I often ask people, have you ever seen or heard of a telex machine? I mean, in this room, I guess a lot of people have. But you'd be amazed how many people didn't even know what a telex machine is. It's like people who have never used a typewriter. So it's the process that really shapes what goes into it. And the notion that there's some master plan is just nonsense. That doesn't mean that editors in New York or Washington or London, when they write the headlines or decide if the story is the lead or at the end of the broadcast or whatever, aren't affected by the discourse, the daily discourse of what's going on. And what's going on in Washington now, for example, is obviously shaping the tone. But for the people in the field, and that's really what China is about, I don't think that really applies.